So, so today, as I said, we're really happy to have Stella with us, and she is a professor of modern European philosophy in the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University here in London. And she's had various kind of big projects, things to do with sex, and she's has a forthcoming book called Vegetal Sex: Philosophy of Plants, which I think is going to be, I'm waiting for this to come out. I'm really anxious to read it, Stella, so let's finish it. And so she's going to talk today about something that's been a really hot topic in botany in my field, is about whether plants are intelligent or not. And I teach in a course on behavior every year, and we always get into very interesting discussions about plants, intelligence, consciousness, and always end up talking about free will. So I'm sure Stella will approach this from a very different perspective than I might, but I really am looking forward to what you're going to have to tell us, Stella. So thank you so much for coming along, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for hosting this lecture, and thanks in particular to Padma for organising things. And thank you everyone for coming along. I'm pleased that you began by talking about the interdisciplinarity of the events at the Linnean Society, because part of what I've been working on recently is part of the attempt to put philosophy and botany back together a little bit. They were the same thing, I mean, for a long time, but they've become estranged, and I'm working with some other people to think about the ways in which philosophers can think about botany, and botanists can think about the philosophical issues that are raised by thinking about plants. So our topic today concerns actually two areas in the plant sciences that perhaps more than any other have really caught the public imagination and have been the subject of many actually very successful works of popular science. So I'm talking, of course, about the idea that plants have senses, and in particular the idea that they can in some sense see or hear, and the idea of plant intelligence. And these things fall under the broad category of plant behavior. Now, defenses of claims about plant sensing and plant intelligence are often presented as criticisms of anthropocentric prejudices, where anthropocentrism means the presumption that humans are the highest point in the evolution of living beings, and that all other species are judged to be of worth according to how closely they approach human being and human capacities. And one prominent writer on plant intelligence, Paco Calvo, said recently that this anthropocentric view of the hierarchy of living forms leads to plants being considered as evolutionary simpletons. This anthropocentric prejudice also means that humans, or so-called higher mammals more generally, tend to be taken more or less consciously as the model or the standard when we're thinking about and judging the behavior of living forms. Now, I think, in fact, the problem that Calvo identifies is more generally the presumption of the biological superiority, not just of human life, but of animal life over plant life. And we can call this presumption zoocentrism, because it privileges the animal over the plant. This zoocentrism, I'm going to say today, has two aspects: a kind of moral aspect and a methodological aspect. What we can call moral zoocentrism is the idea that, or that moral zoocentrism values animal and human life above plant life, or thinks that animal and human life is somehow more worthy of consideration than plant life, and this despite the fact that the vast majority of the biomass of the planet is plant life. The other aspect of that I've called here methodological zoocentrism is the tendency to take the animal as the model when investigating or thinking about plant life. In the early history of botany, the presumption of the animal model was perfectly explicit. And well into the 19th century, investigations of plant life proceeded through analogies with animals. And that, in fact, this is still evident in some of the terminology used to describe the parts of plants. The use of the animal analogy isn't really explicit in botany anymore, but it arguably survives in the way that, in the popular imagination, in the way that plants tend to be thought of as lacking in relation to animals. So plants are often described negatively in relation to animals. For example, they have no nervous system, or they cannot move location, they cannot feel, and so on. So this zoocentric context is the context of the claims about plant sensing and plant intelligence. And in this lecture, I would like to suggest two things. First, that although a lot of the discussion of plant sensing presents itself in opposition to what I've here called moral zoocentrism, it doesn't actually itself escape what I've called methodological zoocentrism. But the second point I want to make is that discussion of plant intelligence is of a different order, and that does really quite fundamentally challenge our moral and methodological zoocentric and anthropocentric presumptions. So let's start with plant sensing. As I said, discussions of plant sensing fall under the broad category of plant behavior. What is plant behavior? The well-known plant physiologist Anthony Truavas wrote that plant behavior is simply what plants do rather than what they are or what attributes they have. And behaviors include foraging for light, water, and nutrients, and so on. But plant behavior also includes growth and gross morphogenesis itself. And as we know, that is extremely plastic in plants. Attempts to understand these behaviors have hitherto mostly been in terms of plant physiology, genetics, evolution, and ecology. And there seems to have been a presumption that all plant behavior could in principle be explained in biomechanical or biochemical terms as more or less automatic reaction or a reflex. But more recently, a controversial new tendency in the scientific study of plants has emerged. And researchers working in this field are insisting that descriptions and explanations of plant behavior be expanded to include reference to things normally only associated with animal or even more exclusively human behavior, things like sensory perception, especially sight and hearing, and forms of communication. And as I said, these claims about sensory perception and communication in plants have been particularly enthusiastically received in popular forums. So I'll just look at very briefly at some of the scientific papers that are making these claims, and then at the way that these papers make their way into the popular presentation of science. So can plants see? Everyone.
Stella,
Yes?
Stella, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I think when you're moving your papers, the computer is picking up the sound and it's rustling. If you could just, thank you so much. Sorry.
That's okay. So the question, can plants see? Everyone is agreed that photosynthesizing plants have different types of photoreceptors for the detection of different light wavelengths. And everyone is agreed that through these photoreceptors, plants receive information about the light environment, and that this information is somehow connected with other kinds of information, for example, about temperature. And the coordination of all this information regulates plant behavior. So it's uncontroversial that plants detect light in this way. It has also been argued that this photoreceptive capacity in plants is linked to what is called kin recognition, where recognition is indicated, for example, in leaf growth in plants away from kin plants to allow those kin plants access to light. And it's also even proposed that plants generate specific patterns in reflected light signals that are recognized by their kin more than they are recognized by other plants. These claims can be made, and indeed they have been made, without reference to the capacity for sight. But František Baluška and Stefano Mancuso refer to the research on kin recognition and to the phenomenon of leaf mimicry as well, to argue that higher plants experience a sort of vision using plant-specific ocelli, little eyes, the upper epidermal cells of many leaves that are shaped like convex or plano-convex lenses, capable of bringing convergence of the light rays on the light-sensitive subepidermal cells. And this, according to Bulushka and Mancuso, suggests that there is some sort of plant-specific vision, perception of body shapes of neighboring plants via a specific sensory system capable not only of sensing, but also of decoding projected images. Now, this suggestion is, of course, highly controversial, and the authors of the research upon which these claims are based totally reject the interpretation of the phenomena in terms of plant vision. Nevertheless, the popular literature has really run with this idea. So in one recent book, Fleur Dogi writes that we can agree that plants possess the sense of sight because they perceive light. We can agree, she says, on the basis of this research, that plants see each other. In his popular works, the botanist Stefano Mancuso similarly equates perception of light with sight. And he argues not only that plants do indeed have this sense of sight, but that they have all 5 senses, just like us, he says. The forester and popular science writer Peter Wohlleben infers from the relation between length of day and the triggering of springtime growth that trees must have some kind of ability to see, he says. And this is how these ideas found their way into Scientific American magazine in 2007. Others, like the plant geneticist Daniel Chamovitz, are a little more wary of the claim that plants possess the sense of sight, but still he writes that Charles and Francis Darwin proved that it is the shoot tip of a plant that sees the light, and that plants have a visual system, although of course they don't see in pictures. He says, plants don't have eyes, just as we don't have leaves, but we can both detect light. But the question is detecting light the same as seeing? I think not, and we'll return to this. Now, similar kinds of claims are made about plant hearing. We know that vibration is a constant feature of the subterranean environment. It's not much of a stretch to presume that living beings rooted in the ground might be sensitive to vibration. We know that plants are hydrotropic, that is, we know that their roots will grow towards soil with a higher moisture gradient. In experiments conducted by Monica Galliano and Marshall Depczynski, Seedlings, this is from the paper that I'm talking about here, this is a sort of simplified figure of the experiment. They found that seedlings would not just grow towards an accessible water source, but also towards inaccessible running water. In these same experiments, however, seedlings grew away from a recorded sound of water running through pipes. And Galliano and Depczynski interpret these results to show that the seedlings, I quote, respond to acoustic vibrations generated by water moving inside pipes and propagated through the substrate. That is, plants detect sounds and indeed discriminate sound sources. Now, in this paper, Galliano and Depczynski don't actually claim that plants hear, but the equation of vibration with sound, or the characterization of the vibrations as acoustic, do imply an aural mode of sensibility to vibration. And when it finds its way into the popular literature, for again quoting Dogi, she describes this in terms of listening and hearing roots. And Mancuso similarly, quite straightforwardly, ascribes to plants the ability to hear. In their justifications of this, both note that animal audition is, of course, reception of vibration as sound waves. But in order for the reception of vibration to be experienced as sound specifically, a specific receptive apparatus is required, and there's no evidence for this in plants. So we can, and indeed scientists do, speculate as to the mechanoperceptive means of reaction to vibration in plants. But to describe these phenomena in terms of acoustics and sounds is to lead inexorably to the idea that plants hear more or less like we do. And this is how this found its way into the Atlantic magazine in 2019. And you can see how it's just translated into the straightforward claim that plants can hear. Other uncontroversial aspects, I think they're now uncontroversial aspects of plant science, are also controversially interpreted in terms of a kind of plant language. So, for example, it's established that plants release volatile organic compounds in response to various stimuli, and that these volatile substances are received as signals that provoke further responses from different parts of the same plant or other plants, and indeed from animals and insects. And some plants respond to herbivore damage to leaves by producing molecules in the damaged leaf or even in the undamaged leaf on the same plant that deter the herbivore. And the fact that some other undamaged plants in the vicinity of the damaged plant may also start producing these substances strongly suggests that there's signals passing from plant to plant, not just in the air, but also via underground mycorrhizal networks. The popular scientific interpretation of these phenomena is again strikingly anthropomorphic. Volatile signaling is represented in the popular literature as plants, and especially trees, talking to each other, using their chemical signals as words even to warn each other of potential threat. So here is, for example, a page from the Guardian website from 2018, where plants are both talking and listening, because if some plants are going to talk, others have got to hear or listen. Now, I said before that this recent research on plant sensing aims to counter the zoocentric prejudice that's tended to minimize the sophistication of plant life. And the effect of this zoocentric prejudice is to imagine plant life as kind of inert or passive, as is shown in the fact that we refer to humans who are incapable of any meaningful response as being in a vegetative state. And this research on plant sensing certainly does counter this moral zoocentrism by revealing these really extraordinary and sophisticated and fascinating plant behaviors. But to insist on interpreting them as capacities for sight and hearing, and to conceive of signaling in terms of linguistic communication, does not escape the zoocentric model. It sees plants through the lenses of zoology still. Now, in the popular literature, such as this piece from The Guardian, this is, of course, a communicative device. It's a way of presenting the unfamiliar in familiar terms as an aid to public understanding. But the fact is that the science on which the popular literature is based often does exactly the same thing. And in this particular area, the scientists are very often the ones producing the popular literature too. I would like to suggest that in doing this literature, and maybe even this science, is prevented from understanding the plant in plant-specific terms. So, of course, plant photoreceptors can be compared to animal photoreceptors, but what's very specific about the behaviors of plants and the processes that are dependent on plants' photoreceptors, photosynthesis, phototropism, and so on, all these are probably actually ill understood by being subsumed under the zoological category of sight. The capacity of plants to sense and react to vibrations, not just in one part of the plant through any organ, is indicates a form of sense that actually exceeds human hearing, and volatile chemical signaling and mycorrhizal communication is I suggest actually very, very little like talking. It just isn't linguistic communication. So to shoehorn the description of these really fascinating forms of communication into the model of speech overlooks what's specific to it. And in this image here from the Guardian website, you can see that it says that plants have their own unique forms of communication, but it describes them in specifically human, it describes them as specifically human and animal forms of communication. It describes them as talking and listening. So, I mean, the question I would like to ask is, well, what if plants really did have unique forms of communication. What would it be like to try to describe those without falling back on a zoocentric model? When it appears that plants have perceptual capacities like sensitivity to humidity, sensitivity to gravity, and to electromagnetic fields, when it appears that plants have these capacities actually in ways that far exceed these capacities as we see them exhibited in humans, for example, why would we continue to approach these aspects of plant behavior through a human model or an animal model? What would it be like to try to adopt instead a phytocentric model when thinking about plants? And I don't have much time to say anything about it today, but it's this question that is driving an emerging field in a subfield, let's say, in philosophy called plant philosophy. And two of the major contributors to this emerging field of plant philosophy are Jacques Tassin and Francis Allais, who are plant scientists. Towards the end of his book, In Praise of Plants, published in 1999, Allais writes, "I dream of a botany that could determine itself autonomously according to its own rules, no longer lagging behind animal or human physiology, thinking about the plant itself as an original form of life, as a model with respect to autonomy and the restoration of the environment. Botany could then regain its place at the center of the life sciences. But what I'm suggesting is it won't do that, so long as it continues, wittingly or unwittingly, to rely on animal models in discussions of plant behavior." Now, given what I've said, you might think that the same arguments would hold against the idea of plant intelligence, but I think this is actually a different matter. The claims about plant sight and hearing are interpretations of the results of experiments, and they ascribe specific capacities to plants according to analogies with animals. But the claims about intelligence are, or they can be, of a different order. The advocates of plant intelligence don't arrive at the idea of plant intelligence after conducting experiments with plants. They don't posit it as the result of experiments. The idea of plant intelligence, indeed the idea of biological intelligence more generally, is instead a way of viewing plants that orients the investigation of plant life. So I'm saying it's not the outcome of an investigation of plant life. It's almost like a kind of axiom or regulative idea that orients the investigation from the beginning. Now, as far as I'm aware, this idea of plant intelligence is most closely associated with Anthony Trewavas. And he borrows from David Stenhouse the very general idea that intelligence is adaptively variable behavior within the lifetime of the individual. And as plant behavior, that is response to internal and external signals, is typically expressed as growth and development, this leads Trewavas to define plant intelligence as, we have it here, adaptively variable growth and development during the lifetime of the individual. According to Trewavas and others, the major obstacle in accepting the idea of plant intelligence is once again anthropocentrism, and more specifically the conflation of intelligence with human-style cognition. So if we think that intelligence is equivalent to the intellectual capacity for cleverness, then we may well think that plants could not possibly be described as intelligent. And in that case, the understanding of plant behaviors will be reduced to their understanding in terms of forced reactions or response reflexes. But Trewavas argues instead, as others have done, that human-style cognition, cleverness, if you like, is only one form of the expression of biological intelligence. Intelligence in general is adaptive behavior or problem solving, and all living organisms must therefore be intelligent if they are to survive. Organisms must react to specific and indeed in each time unique sets of circumstances in specific ways and have some way of assessing those circumstances so as to produce the most appropriate response. All living organisms are faced with basic biological problems like finding food, avoiding predators, and so on. And the ability to deal with these problems, or the ability to survive, is what Truavas calls intelligence. So in plants, intelligence is adaptation of the individual solving its local problems by phenotypic plasticity, and he says if we could monitor it sufficiently well, metabolic and genomic plasticity too. When we think about intelligence in this way, we can see that it's not one property of an organism amongst other properties, or it's not a property that an organism may or may not have. In Truavas's thinking, it is the very capacity for adaptive behavior. Now, Truavas develops his argument within a systems theoretical approach. He describes a system as a network of mutually dependent and thus interconnected components comprising a unified whole. And living organisms, considered as individuals, are biological self-organizing systems in this sense, although the environment is arguably also part of each system. All systems, he says, possess emergent properties, that is, properties of the system itself, properties of the system itself, not properties of the constituent parts. And intelligence is an emergent property in this sense. But as I said, it's not just one property amongst others, and it can't be understood as an evolved feature, because on this understanding, there is no evolution without intelligence. Because of this, I think that Truavas's work on plant intelligence can actually even be interpreted as arguing that biological intelligence is a feature of life itself. We could even say that to be alive is to be biologically intelligent, or is to be a biologically intelligent system. That's probably better. To be alive is to be a biological system that adapts to the problems posed to it by its environment and responds successfully enough to maintain the system. And accordingly, there can be no non-intelligent life. So to say that plants are intelligent is not to say that on the basis of studies of plant behavior, one is led to the conclusion that plants possess the property of intelligence. It's a kind of, as I said, an axiomatic postulate that allows one to study plant behaviors as adaptive, or allows one to understand adaptively variable growth and development as such. And in this sense, the idea of plant intelligence is not zoocentric, because the idea of intelligence becomes a basic biological postulate. Is to be alive is to be an intelligent system. Although I'll just, as an aside, say that that might mean that we should have to say that viruses are alive, because they may meet the definition of an intelligent system. But according to this definition, it doesn't make sense to say that humans are more intelligent than plants, because intelligent behavior can only be expressed within the confines of the behavioral capacities of an organism. And of course, those capacities vary from organism to organism. So if intelligent behavior maximizes the fitness of an organism, each different kind of organism will have its own set of intelligent behaviors. And it makes no sense to say that an organism, a non-human organism that does not have the set of human behaviors, is less intelligent than the human, because it has the right set of intelligent behaviors to ensure its own survival and maximize its own fitness. So to conclude, there can be no doubt that the new research in plant behavior is fascinating, and moreover, actually fantastically important, because it's helping us to understand ecosystems, helping scientists to think about ecological restoration, for example, and the various ways in which vegetable life can help mitigate the effects of climate change. For anyone in botany or philosophy interested in the possibility of thinking about plants from a phytological point of view, this research is in itself interesting regardless of its immediate applications. And if it was needed, it certainly has put paid to the idea that plants are passive, inert, unresponsive forms of life. It certainly leads to a greater appreciation of what is in fact the staggering complexity of plant being. But it seems to me that it's a mistake to think that we can only appreciate the complexity of plant life by finding in it analogues of human or animal life. And what would be really exciting would be to work out plant models for plant sensing, if that were possible. So plant sensing is currently understood in terms familiar to us from animal sensing. What if it required new and unanticipated terms? We won't even open up the space for those new and unanticipated terms, so long as we continue to think of plant sensing in terms of seeing, hearing, and so on. Thank you.
Sorry, Stella, my little microphone was not turning on. Thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture and really interesting view of all of that. And as you predicted, we're starting to get lots of questions. So the first one is about, and I'll kind of shorten it, it's about chemical signals. And do you think it's our human inability to perceive chemical signals that makes us think that that's not as important as our way of seeing?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think, you know, it seems that we are unable to perceive these signals, although some of them, like when we cut an onion and our eyes water, we're certainly perceiving a signal from a plant then.
And it's chemical as well.
Yes, yes, but it's not, but the onion is not communicating with us, in my view. You know, the idea of forest bathing, you know, the idea that we feel really good when we walk through forests, you know, it's possible that we could in the future that we'll work out why it is that we feel good. Are we in fact perceiving signals, chemical signals from trees that we don't know about? But yes, certainly in general, the fact that we haven't been able to, the fact that there's so much about plant life that eludes our immediate perception, the fact that they don't move from location to location and so on, allows them to be overlooked. So you'll even find, you know, that people think if they're going on a walk in the countryside and they hope they might see some nature, what they mean is they might see some birds or some animals, as if all of everything around them is not life. So
it's the thing about plants being the background, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And also the fact that a lot of this kind of chemical signaling goes on underground. Yes. But yet we smell things like flowers and the scent of soil and, you know, all those other things. It's just we don't really, you know, mind you, all of our kind of behavior is chemical signaling as well. It's just a different kind. Yes. You know, the taste of hotness in chilies is all about same chemical signal as putting your hand on a hot plate. There's another, this is a really interesting question, and I, you know, it's something that's probably worth thinking about is, can you tell us if there's any link between this field and the emerging AI field of computer vision? Whoops, all those things. So there's this emerging field in artificial intelligence about computer vision. And so would this have any bearing on this, or could there be links between those two things? Well,
I'm not aware of that, of work in that field, but I mean, connected to the idea of plant intelligence is the idea of plant memory and plant learning. And I actually think we can talk about plant memory and plant learning in non-zoocentric terms, just as we talk about machine memory and machine learning. Although once we start to say things like, you know, that the plant remembers something, it's a bit different from just describing a memory to it. Similarly, when we're talking about machine vision, are we using a metaphor, or are we actually saying that the machine is seeing in the same way that we're seeing? So the question is partly, when do we move from metaphor to speaking literally about the phenomena that we're speaking about? it seems to me that in this literature on plant sensing, they have moved from metaphor to making literal claims about plant seeing and plant hearing. Perhaps if it were kept at the level of metaphor, that would be fine, but metaphors always have a tendency to be misunderstood in literal terms. And that's why I showed these examples from the popular scientific literature, because in the popular representation of this science, it immediately becomes literal claims about
well, the
seeing.
nuance goes away, doesn't it?
Exactly,
You know.
Although I have to say, I don't find much nuance in some of the scientific literature itself. But I do, and I know that that literature is controversial. It's not like it represents the mainstream of research in plant behavior, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So there's a question here about viruses. About viruses is they can only be regarded as alive once they've entered a cell. But there is a whole question about whether viruses are alive or not.
Yes,
isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, one of the really fascinating aspects of plant philosophy, but as I said, plant philosophy is equally associated with botanists like Jacques Tassin, for example, who's written some very interesting stuff, is that when you start to really think about plants as plants, and we're talking about, you know, whole plants, so not sort of biochemically at the level of the cell, but when you start thinking about forms of plant life and forms of plant behavior, we begin to see that lots of the categories that we use to understand human life and animal life simply don't apply to plants in the same way, like the category of the individual, for example. And also the distinction between life and death is not the same in the plant world as it is in the animal world. Plants can bear dead parts of themselves upon themselves, you know, without any problem. They can parts of them can die, and then they can live off their dead parts in a way. So, you know, one of the really interesting things about this new plant philosophy is the way that it starts to question question some of the categories that we really take for granted through looking at plants as plants without the zoocentric model. So there will be implications for how we think about viruses as well, I suppose, and how we conceive the distinction between life and death. I knew if I put that thing as an aside about viruses, it would be picked up on, but
yeah.
Perhaps need a
no, but it is. I think you're quite right. Is that the sort of thinking about plants as kind of things in their own right, without them just being background, is a really it makes you really question some of the other things that we feel are odd about the rest of the world, like starfish regenerating limbs, for example. That's always, you know, in zoology, that's always taught as being odd, whereas for plants, that's pretty straightforward. It's pretty normal.
That's the sort of argument that Francis Halley makes as well, by I mean, almost gets to the point of saying there is no such thing as the abnormal in the plant world, because, you know, we imagine trees must have a specific kind of structure with a trunk and then branches, but no, you know, trees just don't grow like that.
No,
it's really quite difficult to say what would an abnormal shaped tree be. There almost is no possibility for an abnormal shaped tree when you're thinking in the tree's terms, if that were possible, rather than in our terms.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Francis Halley is amazing. So so now wait a minute, I've lost the thread of these questions again now. Someone has asked, is there the possibility of plant suffering, and is suffering linked to intelligence and the senses?
Well, I think that is probably an open question in this literature. I think that in the popular presentation, I mean, for example, Peter Wohlleben, he's quite happy to speak about plant suffering, or tree suffering in particular. But I'm not sure that we know yet what the criteria would be to be able to speak about plant suffering. I don't think that intelligence necessarily implies suffering. And remember, actually, you know, if we're going to take that if we're going to take that definition of biological intelligence on board, we'd have to be saying the same about bacteria.
Yeah.
Everything. Yeah. So I don't think that intelligence implies necessarily suffering, but I know that the idea of plant suffering is bubbling up in the literature.
Yeah. So so someone has asked about, would the old experiments on the, and I'm not quite sure what this is referring to, of mucor spore heads show it to possess intelligence? I think that means I'm not sure what that quite means. But there's those old experiments of things bending. Would that show intelligence?
Well, according to the definition of intelligence that I find in Anthony Truavas, the fact that something is alive and responding to its environment is de facto proof that it's intelligent. Because I think that Truavas doesn't say this, but his work can be interpreted almost to the point of the idea that intelligence is a definition of life, or biological intelligence is a definition of life, because there can be machine intelligence, for example. So anything that's alive is and responding to its environment and surviving and adapting is intelligent. And plant adaptation to the environment is much more is quicker, as it were, than an animal adaptation to the environment, because growth is adaptation to the environment.
It's also sort of more subtle in some ways.
Yes, yes.
You know, and hard to see.
Yes.
So there's one. So this is quite a complicated question, but I'll just read it. Is one of the questions that comes up in this zoocentric way of seeing, hearing, and thinking is whether there's an I, whether there's the agency of an I, an internality doing the activity, rather than it being an intelligent but mechanical response. So are there people who argue that plants might have this kind of I sort of internality?
Yeah, well, I think that in the literature that I've read, it's probably, the question is probably asked in the context of asking if there is a plant self. Because I is a first person pronoun. It's a linguistic category, and I'm not prepared to think that linguistic categories like that can apply to plants. Yeah. Does a plant have a self? That's connected to the idea of whether a plant can be thought of as an individual. So in a lot of the work on kin recognition, for example, there will be what is called the mother plant, and the kin could very well be clones from the mother plant, or they could be cuttings from the mother plant. At what point do they stop being part of that plant and become a separate plant? Is kin recognition actually self-recognition? Does it make any sense to
in that case it would be, because a clone is a clone is a clone. They're genetically the same.
But when once they're separated, they might adapt differently to different environments, immediate environments. Sooner or later, one might say it's become, as it were, a different individual. But so the whole question of what an individual is extremely complicated. And I think the whole question of whether a plant has a self is bound up with that. So individuals, the classic definitions of an individual is that it is indivisible. Well, that's not true of a plant. There are kind of genetic definitions of individuals. Plants can be genetic mosaics. That doesn't seem to work. There are kind of immunological definitions of an individual. You can graft one plant onto another plant. So in every way you look at it, rather than just saying we have a category of the self, does it apply to the plant? In a way, the more interesting question is, what does the specificity of plant being do to our category of the self? We have to start thinking about these things in different ways once we start recognizing the as I said, the specificity of plant being, as we would say in philosophy. So it really is a sort of concerted attempt to avoid just putting the animal model onto the plant, and thinking instead, what does the plant model do for the way we think about our relations with the environment, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because in a way, you get you know, you always say that it's always easier to understand someone else if you put yourself in their
Yeah.
shoes. And so that applies across the
Yeah.
tree of life as well, really,
Yes.
which is slightly more difficult than if it's another person, of course, because it's a bit easier. So there's loads of questions, and I'm probably not going to get to them all, but there are sort of questions about soul and desire and things like that. And I think you've kind of answered that in the last, in your last sort of discussion of putting those categories onto plants that we think of as our self-having. But would you say anything special about desire and soul?
Well, I mean, again, I know that these are questions that do come up in reflections on this literature on plant sensing and plant intelligence. I mean, it's interesting that for a long time, well into the 19th century, I would say, botany was really dominated by Aristotelian philosophy. And Aristotelian philosophy, thinking about life, made a distinction between three kinds of soul: a vegetative or a nutritive soul, a perceptive soul, and then a rational soul. And all living beings, insofar as they are living beings, have this vegetative soul. So it's as if, it's quite actually straightforward. He says plants do have this kind of soul. But what it means to have that kind of soul is just to be alive and capable of reproduction. So in some plant philosophy, people are going back to that Aristotelian idea of the vegetative soul to think again about, what do we mean by soul? So I don't believe plants have a rational soul. I believe that they have some form of sensory perception. I'm not sure if perception is the right word for it. But we would have to say, what is required for us to be able to speak of desire? Would plants fulfill that? I'm not sure that they would, because I think I admire Travis's work on plant intelligence very much, but I think he is wrong when he thinks that if we accept plant intelligence, we must also accept that plants have purposes and intentions, which he does, because I think we can think of intelligence as functional, and we can think of all adaptation as functional and purposeful in that sense. But to have intentions or to intend something, these seem to me to be reflective cognitive acts. And I know in the literature that wants to speak about plant cognition, for example, their position is you don't want to allow that to plants because you're too jealous of your own, specialness as a human being. But I think actually the opposite is true. I don't think that we need to find everything that we find in ourselves in plants in order to find their behaviors interesting and worthy of study.
That's great. So someone has asked a really specific question, is can you give an example of plant intelligence?
Yes, well, I'll give you an example that Travis gives. So he makes a distinction between sort of random behavior and intelligent behavior. So if you uprooted a plant that had lots of very long, thin roots, it would look to us like those roots had grown in a completely higgledy-piggledy way, but they haven't. They've all grown to avoid obstacles. They have all grown towards moisture. So in his terms, those roots have grown intelligently. That is, they have grown in such a way, they have adapted almost in such a way as to maximize the plant's chance of survival. And that for him counts as intelligent behavior. So anything that maximizes fitness or tends towards the survival of the plant is intelligent behavior, even if from our point of view it looks like some kind of automatic behavior. So with the cutting of onions example, that's just that the cell wall breaks and the volatiles are released. The onion doesn't think, oh, I'm going to release my volatiles now.
But some plants do that. But some plants do that.
Yeah,
I mean,
yes,
tobaccos do that.
Yeah, responding to
too.
cues, probably. Responding
Yeah.
to cues. But it would also mean that insofar as we as humans have any instinctual behaviors left, there would still be intelligent behaviors for us.
Yeah.
In fact, his definition of, no, let's not go there, no. So there's,
Yeah.
so actually basically any adaptive behavior is intelligent behavior.
Yeah. So there's a couple of interesting questions about other worldviews, one of which is kind of the LBGT worldview and how is that intersecting with plant biology. But the other one is about how this plant philosophy actually links to non-European philosophies and how much, because what you've described is very much that kind of Aristotelian kind of way of looking at it. So is there any work being done on these other ways of other types of philosophies?
Well, funny you should ask that, because my book, Vegetal Sex, which is coming out in the autumn, deals with both of these questions. So this kind of non-zoological approach to plant behavior that I've been trying to talk about in the book, I try to think about the ways in which we have spoken about plant sexes, and the ways in which we have always actually imposed a zoological model onto plants when thinking about plant sexes, apart from some honorable exceptions, like, for example, the botanist David G. Lloyd, who tried to develop a specific plant concept of plant gender. I have a chapter on that. And at the end point of this is really to say, if we're going to maintain a generic concept of sex, such that we're going to say that parts of plants are sexed and animals are sexed and humans are sexed, what is the generic concept of sex? What does it boil down to? And it boils down to very, very little in the end, and it certainly must be radically distinguished from gender, sexuality, and all forms of, in my view, all forms of social behaviors. So there is, I have addressed that in the book. Also, there's some very interesting recent anthropology that looks at, for example, Amerindian sort of demotic philosophies, which from the Western anthropological point of view, we call animism. And those animisms ascribe, well, we think from the Western point of view, they're ascribing human attributes to animals, plants, and so on.
Well, everything has agency in those kind of philosophies. Yeah.
There's some very interesting work, particularly by an anthropologist called, I can't think of his first name, Vivaros de Castro, that's his surname, who's looked at these Amerindian, he calls them, animisms, and says the difference between that sort of anthropocentrism and the sort of anthropocentrism that we've been looking at today is that this animist anthropocentrism actually forces one to rethink what one means by the human. It's a sort of two-way anthropocentrism, because when you start saying that the panther is a human, you have to start, he says, when everything is human, we have to radically rethink what we mean by human,
and our interactions and behaviors towards them.
So yes, at the end of the book, I think that's tried to sort of gesture towards the ways in which these thinking about non-Western ways of thinking about the relations between humans and animals and humans and plants might bring up some very interesting stuff for us to think about.
So when is the book out, Stella?
In the autumn, I'm hoping.
In the autumn. Okay, so we'll need to post a link somewhere to it in the autumn. There's an interesting question here about whether or not, and Zia has put some really interesting exhibitions which have just opened in the chat for anyone who's interested in that, in kind of some of the stuff that Stella's been talking about. But there's a question about, do plants hurt each other as in human beings having war? And I would suggest that you watch David Attenborough's Green Planet and watch the episode with the Victoria water lily. to
Yeah.
answer that question, because
Yes,
plants can be pretty aggressive with each other.
Yes, it's true, but it's very anthropomorphic.
Yeah, it's very
That's
anthropocentric.
especially-
It's very
It
anthropocentric.
really does. As is also in this popular literature, it's really common to talk about the relations between plants and the relation between plants and insects in terms of capitalist market exchanges, which again, I think, well, you know, maybe it gets the point across, but it's certainly not understanding plants from a phytological point of view, if that is possible.
Well, so what do you think about, I'm going to ask my own question now because I can, is what do you think? So there's a really interesting thing that's happening in the sort of in the kind of plant breeding and crop biology literature, which is people are starting to not talk about pests and pathogens, but starting to talk about herbivores and diseases, instead of this kind of very kind of that sort of exchange thing between the the plants.
Yes.
And the herbivore, which is doing what it does best, which is eating plant tissue.
Yes, yes. I'm not aware of that literature. That sounds very interesting.
Well, it's not a literature. It's just that people are starting to switch, talking. It's just a kind of very gentle, one of those things that some people have thought, well, wait a minute, you know, why are we using this word when actually what we really mean is this word?
Yes.
So it's not so much a literature. It's more like a kind of a very gradual shift.
Connected to people starting to think about what they're doing when they call some plants weeds as well. Absolutely.
So that's my favorite topic, is what a weed are weeds. I love weeds, but it's it's that thing of what is a weed and you know, how does that work? But it's absolutely fascinating. So somebody's asked another question, which I mean, I think I'm just going to have this be the last one, because we can't keep you here forever, Stella, although I'd really rather like to, is people have asked someone's asked if plants can recognize faces and know who's looking after them and who's damaging them.
Well, who knows? The book that everyone now wants to distance themselves from is that famous book by who is it called? Well, it's published in the 70s, called The Secret Life of Plants.
Yes.
In which some extremely dubious experiments allegedly showed that if a person had harmed a plant, the next time that person walked into the room, you could measure the plant's reaction. And the same book also said plants were communicating with aliens, and everyone wants to distance themselves from that book. But I'm not sure that any talk about plants recognizing us can distance itself from that sort of pseudoscience.
It was Peter Tompkins and Christopher Birds, wasn't it? Yeah, it was that book.
Yes.
Yeah, I just was dredging around in my brain for who the authors were.
You know, each time we ask a question like, can plants recognize the person who cares for them? We have to say to ourselves, what would it mean to recognize? What does to recognize mean? Even when we talk about human beings, it means to have brought back into our mind a memory through sight, hearing, smell, taste, so on. Who knows what capacities plants have to detect the signals that we're giving out that we don't know about? We don't know what they are. But my sort of basic point is, nor will we really find that out so long as we just keep wanting to find in them the things that we already know about ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask this very last question, because I think the answer to this is absolutely yes. Is can plants make mistakes? And they certainly can. You can try to grow in the wrong place and you've had it.
Yes, yeah, and then you die.
And then you die.
Yeah.
So a mistake is a failure to kind of pass on your genes to the next generation.
Yeah.
You know, evolutionarily, that's what a mistake is.
Yeah.
So super interesting. Oh, Stella, I'm sure we could just go on asking questions and answering questions. And I'm sure this is something that would be great if we came back in 2 or 3 years when the field has kind of settled down and moved on a bit, because it's a really big paradigm change that we're undergoing now. So it's super interesting, and thanks everybody for all your questions. And I apologize to those of you whose questions I didn't get to, but but I'm sure that there'll be another talk about plant intelligence or plant consciousness or whatever we want to call it. But I think the idea that intelligence and adaptation are very closely linked, if not the same thing, is a really interesting one. So thank you so much, Stella. And I really look forward to the book coming out. It's going to be fantastic. And thanks a lot for coming along today. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks everybody for participating.